he had asked the patient if she had ever been involved in a threesome, which in my opinion as a lawyer, I can see that as being pretty unprofessional. There might be better ways to state it. Maybe I would ask it as, have you ever had any sexual encounters that you would consider risky? Or have you ever had any sexual encounters with multiple partners?
At the rate we're going, maybe there's one day that no one wants to pursue this medical career anymore because of the high risk of loss of life, of suicide, of mental health, of physical health. When you're putting so much of yourself into studying, into learning as much as you can, into working as much as you can for your patients.
Ultimately, that night, he ends up committing suicide and taking his own life. The next morning, a very tragic event. But then it starts spiraling in over the next year as far as, could this have been prevented? Did the school handle it appropriately? Did the administration handle it appropriately?
Medicine,
Law, friendship. This is Dr. Long and Lawyer Nick. You're listening to the Medico-Legal Brief.
one doctor, one lawyer, and a whole lot of gray area.
Hello, listeners. This is another episode of the Medico-Legal Brief, where medicine meets the law. I'm Lawyer Nick. As always, I'm here with Dr. Long. And Dr. Long, we have another case analysis before us regarding a tragic event where a med student ended up taking his own life. And I want to dive into the details about it with you and understand the pressures that med students face, as well as the appropriate due diligence and academic hearings that take place if a med student messes up, as well as just an overall thought from the medical community. With that, I want to first ask you, how stressful is medical school?
Obviously, getting into medical school is already stressful enough, but once you're in, the stress of studying 24/7, these very, very high stakes examinations that you have to take for the first 2 years of your educational career, and then the last 2 years of your medical school, you're spending in front of patients, in front of people, and putting that knowledge that you've learned into action, and that can be really stressful. It's a very high burnout career choice. It's not something that anyone takes lightly. It's something that we are constantly losing sleep over, committing a decade of our life to, if not a little bit longer. So absolutely a high stress, high stakes couple of years there during medical school before you even get into residency, which is a whole nother beast and something that we could potentially touch on a little later in the episode.
Now, in previous podcasts, we've discussed the pressures of the actual profession, whether it's a doctor, physician, or a lawyer. And we focus on the stress that we experience in our careers. We talked about suicide rates. We've talked about substance abuse, whether it's drugs or alcohol. We talked about divorce. Something that sometimes it's overlooked is the stress that we place on students. You just mentioned we work so hard to achieve a goal, and that is to get into medical school or get into law school. And that is in an attempt to achieve a bigger goal, which is become an attorney or become a doctor. And granted, I know that there's resources that every school has, but we focus maybe sometimes on the wrong thing. And that's the struggles of the profession, not necessarily the struggles of the student.
And you just said it right there, is that the focus is just the profession itself. Once you're in the thick of it, your only purpose, or so it seems, is to make it through, is to graduate medical school. Otherwise, it would have been a waste. That stress or that concern that if you do anything wrong, whether you take a misstep, it's going to knock you down a couple rungs or even get you kicked out of medical school. It's a terrible feeling. Anytime you fail a test or anytime you're close to failing a test, it's just another layer of weight that gets put on your shoulder. Most of us already have that doubt, kind of that mentality. What if I'm not good enough? And so anytime that you get knocked down, there's another issue. There's another thing that gets put on your shoulders that you have to carry around. And then on top of that, allegations, legal ramifications, whether they are true or not, is something that can be career ending. And in this situation, unfortunately, it can be life ending too.
Yes, definitely. Let's jump into it. Today, we're going to talk about a student by the name of Vaibhav Duggal. Vaibhav was a medical student at Texas Tech University Health Science Center in El Paso. And he was also a graduate of Texas A&M in College Station. So this is very close to home here in the state of Texas. So he was a third-year medical student at Texas Tech. And in July of 2025, He was doing a OBGYN clinical rotation. Duggal ended up having a patient encounter in which afterwards the patient complained that Duggal was a little bit unprofessional. He asked inappropriate questions. And then it took a further step because Duggal ended up adding the patient on social media. I believe it was Instagram. After that fact, the complaint came to the medical school, and the medical school started implementing a response in order to get to the bottom of it. And ultimately, throughout this process, it ended up with Vaibhav Duggal taking his own life and committing suicide in response to the medical school's allegations, the medical school's complaints, as well as just the overall pressure and situation that he was in.
As we dive deeper into this case, we unfortunately just have surface level information from the news. There is a interview that is done with the parents that gives a little bit more detail. Just quickly looking at the case, it does sound a little concerning that there was this medical student who passed through their first 2 years, which is usually the most difficult years of medical school, was knowledgeable enough to proceed through their third year. And this is when all third years go out and actually do clinical rotations where they switch specialties every month to figure out exactly what type of physician they want to eventually become. And so the student was on an OBGYN, which is going to be your obstetrics and gynecology rotation. This is where all of your patients are going to be female. There's going to be a lot of sensitive information discussed, a lot of sensitive exams to be completed, which is expected in an OBGYN clinic. A lot of the questions that you would typically think about, whether you're 20, 30, 50, 60, that I would personally ask, even in my own clinic that is not an OBGYN clinic, but when we are discussing your health, when we're discussing cancer screenings, STD testing, these are questions that are going to be like, how many sexual partners have you had? Do you use condoms? Do you have birth control? Have you ever had any children in the past? Have you ever been assaulted? A lot of sensitive questions. In this situation, I wonder if there was a miscommunication or misunderstanding. Maybe the student was not able to express the question in an appropriate manner. They were asking it in the wrong way. Sometimes the wording can make the intention seem completely different from what was actually there. And it's hard to say, reflecting back without all the details and without being in the actual room themselves.
And as of right now, I will mention that there is a current court case that is being conducted as of spring of this year, 2026, where the parents have sued the medical school as well as certain administrators. And granted, you want to wait till everything gets clear through the legal process to really understand what evidence is being put forth and who said what. And the main individual who would probably know best is no longer with us, who is the one in the room with the patient. Now, furthering that discussion, which were the points you were touching on, allegations. According to published reports, the patient alleged that Duggal's questions during the appointment were unprofessional. Duggal denied acting inappropriately during the medical encounter, stating that the questions were part of the standard sexual health STD history. And then he also acknowledged following the patient on Instagram. We'll get to that point in a little bit. But I want to go back to the STD testing. One of the allegations, and this is not confirmed, but what I've heard actually via the YouTube video with his parents, he had asked the patient if she had ever been involved in a threesome, which in my opinion as a lawyer, I can see that as being pretty unprofessional and not necessarily applicable. But to what you just said, there might be better ways to state it that he just didn't know how to say. So in a manner in which maybe I would ask it as a lawyer in a professional way, I might ask, have you ever had any sexual encounters that were of this type of nature? Have you ever had any sexual encounters that you would consider risky? Or have you ever had any sexual encounters with multiple partners at once in which you did not use any protective means? Things like that to be professional, but still probably get to the bottom of understanding how risky was this patient's sexual history. And then again, you and I both know that when you're talking to patients and you're talking to clients, sometimes the interaction involves you needing to be more blunt or needing to ask more direct questions to really get an answer. So I can argue it both ways, in which a question might be considered inappropriate, but it might be the only path he knew how to move forward with, especially with him being a student. He is still a student. He is still trying to learn, but under that circumstance, yeah, it could be inappropriate, or it could just be him trying to work his way through the problem.
This is where the case, once the detail comes out, it would be interesting if we're able to hear the questioning style, because these are things that we are taught in our first and second year of medical school, most schools, maybe not directly with the patient, but you are coached in ways to keep the questions open, broad, and then sensitive. So we learn gender identity, we learn how to approach patients who have different gender dysphoria or expect to be titled a certain way or respected a certain way. Those are things that we are taught. But then once you're there in person in real life, those things can sometimes, especially as a third year and you're seeing patients for the first time, it can be very nerve wracking. The choice of words really plays into how the situation could be. Absolutely, if he had come out and asked inappropriate questions and was probing in a manner that was not relevant, like outright asking if they had a threesome, that is a little concerning. We're taught to ask, have you had multiple sexual partners? Do you use any sort of protection? You, even as a lawyer, were able to come up with terminology and statements that were a little bit more neutral, less invasive than what it seems the alleged complaint is.
I would really love to see, maybe in a perfect world, a transcript or a recording. Now, granted, most of the time that's not going to exist, especially with HIPAA laws and doctor-patient confidentiality. But it could have been stated in a manner where he was completely inappropriate and said, "Hey, have you ever had a threesome? Have you ever done that?" and got really excited about it. Or he could have simply said, "Have you ever engaged in anything that you would consider sexually risky?" And she said, "Like what?" And he said, "Well, have you ever been in a threesome?" There could be different ways in which he would have prefaced it that could have been interpreted as inappropriate, but at the same time been appropriate for his level of questioning as he's trying to work his way through.
In fact, this ties in our conversations about AI because AI is being used more frequently now, especially in a session like this. Sometimes they can be recording as they transcribe that conversation into note. I would be curious whether or not there was the allowance of AI during this situation and whether or not that recording would be able to be offered. But like you said, HIPAA would definitely be a big issue here. But again, if the alleged person is saying that this was the case and they want to prove themselves true, then they would want to allow that conversation, at least that section of the conversation, to be out in the open if they truly were that concerned about it.
Now, another thing is the fact that he apparently was alone with the patient. He's doing a patient evaluation in the room, and he does not have anybody in the room with him overseeing the encounter. What is that supposed to look like as far as clinical rotations being a third year and having patient encounters with somebody overseeing what you're doing?
As a third year, most rotations, especially attendings that have worked with medical students in the past, they usually know that the first couple of patient encounters should be done under supervision because that gives the attending physician an opportunity to gauge the student's medical knowledge, but also their rapport building with patients. We all know that not everyone that gets into medical school has the best bedside manner. And so those first couple of days are really important for the attending physician to determine whether or not they are able to continue seeing patients on their own or not. But I would say the majority of medical students do fine in that initial evaluation, and then the rest of that rotation should be able to do the intake on their own without the attending physician in the room, because then it gives the student an opportunity to actually learn. And they're learning how to make decisions, ask questions on their own, and then come out and give their answers. That way, the attending can then probe and make sure, hey, did you ask the appropriate questions? Did you go down the right routes to get the information needed to give a diagnosis? And that's that learning process that is so traditional in the medical model that I would be curious, at what part of the rotation did this happen? Was this the first day of the rotation? Was this in the middle of the month, or was this near the end? That would give some clarity in terms of why he was in there by himself. The other thing that you've already touched on is at any point in time, if there is any sort of sensitive exam or an exam done at all, there should always be a chaperone in the room, especially in an OBGYN clinic. If you are a male, you always, always, always need to have a chaperone when it comes to the physical exam component. The question component, most places do not have enough staff to be able to have a chaperone every single patient for all parts. And I don't know if that is a good thing, a bad thing, if it's appropriate. That is still something that can be litigated out and see how this case goes.
Now, that's very interesting because if you're separating it out during this process, if he was just doing intake, that would make more sense as to why he didn't have a chaperone in there. I'm not necessarily sure if he did any sort of physical examination on her. And if he did, that may have been adding to the appropriateness or the problem that the patient may have seen or interpreted. I've been in doctor's appointments, many of our listeners have, where your intake is literally just a nurse or maybe an assistant that's just trying to get you through, triage you and get you to the doctor. And as far as a student goes, was there some sort of understanding or agreement that she would be interacting with a third-year medical student? Did they ask her, is it okay if we have the third year in here doing the intake? Was there some sort of acknowledgement that she would be seeing a third year medical student? When you have that acknowledgement, you understand that there's some sort of learning that's going to take place. And you almost give that student or that newer person a little bit of grace when they're trying to do their job. If you're going to have a problem with it from the beginning, you need to voice that opinion.
I would say it's pretty standard, actually. I can say 99% of the time there is consent when the initial either nurse or MA that goes into the room to do the triage, they will ask whether or not the patient is okay with a medical student. Because once the MA comes out or the nurse comes out, they will let the student know whether or not they're allowed to come in. That is pretty standard across the board, across the country. Every single rotation that I've done, that has always been the protocol. And so I'm fairly confident that this patient most likely consented to the medical student coming in, doing the intake first before the actual attending came in. Now, where the details may come into play, we actually listened to a interview between the parents giving their perspective of the situation, and they give us a little bit more detail in the timeline of how this occurred. It sounds like during the actual intake, it was just the medical student alone with the patient. However, when it came time to do the examination, he actually offered to the patient whether or not she would prefer the nurse practitioner to come in and do the exam component of it, or if she was okay with him continuing. And it sounds like the patient actually requested the nurse practitioner. And so the nurse practitioner was the one that ultimately did the final exam. And then the other details that was given out is, and again, there's no way to corroborate or confirm this, but the parents said that the student was offered the handle of the social media from the patient. And so that throws an interesting wrench into the story, because if the patient was the one that filed the complaint, why did they offer the handle in the first place? If the handle was not offered, how did the student find the patient? Did the student really look into social media and look up this patient themselves? It can sometimes be fairly hard to find other people, friends, let alone a random stranger, unless you have more details, unless the patient has a fairly big social media presence. But the fact that potentially the patient had offered a handle or the ability to follow, I would be interested to see if that is true or false from the parent's account.
I'm actually very glad that you brought that up, because that was going to be my next transitional point, was talking about the social media aspect of it. With us doing the Medico-Legal Brief and having a podcast, there have been some times when I've been dealing with medical people where I've offered up the fact that we do a podcast. And within the conversation, I say, oh, well, here is our Instagram handle. Here's our YouTube page. You can look us up if you want. Now, granted, that's a more business professional approach. However, to your point, if the patient offered up her handle in an attempt to be nice, or maybe she was building her own brand, because a lot of times in this day and age, your personal brand is something that you lean heavily on. It's not that you have a business, it's the fact that your person is your business. If she was a fitness influencer, if she was a chef, if she was somebody just trying to sell things online, that may have been an instance in which she may have offered up her handle. However, maybe she didn't do it. Maybe she never brought it up at all, but the dynamic is that the third-year medical student has access to all of her personal information. And as a lawyer, I know that we have access to a lot of information. We can run background checks through some of the software programs that we use just by the very nature of being members of that program. So I can figure out what your date of birth is. I can figure out where you live, what your phone number is. I can figure out who you live with, short of finding your social security number, which in most intake forms, I believe social security numbers are thrown in there somewhere along with driver's license. If he wanted to go outside the box and really try to find her and figure out where her Instagram was, or where her TikTok handle was, or even her Facebook, I'm sure it'd be a little bit easier given the background information that he would have to find her. The question at heart really goes to the fact that regardless of the person giving you their handle, regardless of if they want to have a personal relationship with you outside of the professional, there is certain dynamics and standards that need to be put in place. The student adding the woman on social media in and of itself was the wrong approach to it. Because I remember as a law student, as a young lawyer, I would never add our clients to social media. And we would get added all the time because we would have this professional relationship that was on the verge of personal, because you're learning about your patients, you're building the rapport, and all of a sudden they want to be friends, and you think, well, there still needs to be a barrier. I can't just accept you and let you look in on my personal life. There is a professional barrier that needs to exist.
And that's the thing is during your first and second year of medical school, you do have professionalism classes. And so this is where I wonder where the class is not strong enough, we're not in depth enough for this particular student at this particular school, why there was this lapse in judgment. Because I completely agree. We are always taught we never get into any sort of patient relationship outside of work. And the only way you do that is once you've gotten out of the patient doctor relationship. That's the only time. If you no longer see this patient, you've agreed that you're no longer going to see this patient, sure, you can go on a date, you can go get into contact outside of work. But this in itself, being the person to add a patient, whether the patient allowed it or not, was just not a good look. Unfortunately, I do think that that is a ding on his judgment. That is where it probably pushed him in the direction that he chose to end his life, because he knew that something bad was to come from that. But I wish he had given it time for the evidence to come out to potentially even exonerate him. No physical abuse occurred. It was purely just this inappropriate questioning, and that's still up for debate. And then the adding of a patient, it sounded like he blocked the patient an hour after he had added the patient in the first place.
The student was in his mid 20s. And when I was in my mid 20s, there was a lot of stupid things I've done. And you think in the moment, oh, this might be a good idea. And then when you actually start thinking about it, you understand this probably wasn't the best idea, but it happened. And so that doesn't necessarily look good upon the student. And I think that leads into what actually occurred from a disciplinary standpoint. The university's response after they received the complaint is they initiated a disciplinary process. And then there was some discussions with the dean and student services and just Duggal going back and forth and telling his side of the story, but also receiving information from the school. And ultimately, he received a late night email informing him of the allegations and laying out the potential disciplinary consequences that could occur. Apparently, these consequences were, hey, you're no longer going to see any patients for the next 18 days while we continue to conduct more investigation. There was also layout of what could ultimately end up happening if things are found to be below the standard of what the medical school policy and procedures are. There's a lot there. And I think that when you're a student and this is everything you've worked for and you receive a late night email from the administration, there's a lot of pressure that can occur at that moment in time.
Honestly, that all sounds fairly standard. It sounds fairly standard for any sort of allegation. Even when you fail a test or fail multiple courses and you're on the verge of being kicked out of school, that's typically the standards. There's several meetings, and then there's a letter that lays out exactly what needs to be done or what is to be expected over the next several weeks to months to determine the final outcome. So far, based on what we've said, the school board has gone through their usual avenue. This is their standard process for any issue. I'm curious to see what is said in there. I'm sure at the very end of the letter, it probably does notate that there is a potential for dismissal if there is evidence finding that the student did act unprofessionally. But again, just a potential, not a for sure.
So he receives this email. It lays out the potential pathway, pros and cons, what he needs to do, what they're going to be looking at, how they're going to investigate it. And ultimately that night, he ends up committing suicide and taking his own life. Very tragic event, but then it starts spiraling in over the next year as far as could this have been prevented? Did the school handle it appropriately? Did the administration handle it appropriately? Who was right and who was in the wrong? And I think that lays out this dynamic that we've talked to before is the fact that Texas Tech is a public institution. They are essentially a state actor. And that opens up a lot of different legal liability as opposed to a private institution, which doesn't necessarily have to adhere to all rules of the state. But when it comes to this lawsuit that has been filed, his parents have come in and they have alleged a lot of different things. The initial complaint was filed in state court. It ended up getting moved to federal court. And from the last thing I've seen, it's been passed back down to state court. But the complaint alleges that the Texas Tech El Paso officials failed to conduct an impartial investigation. They presumed the student's guilt before completing the investigation. They denied him a meaningful opportunity to defend himself. They deviated from university policies. They ignored warning signs of his deteriorating mental state, and they subjected him to a disciplinary process that foreseeably caused severe psychological harm. In any lawsuit, removing the actual facts from the case, you're suing everybody and you're putting as many allegations in there as possible that you think that you can have a fair argument with in order to get it into court. Because the last thing that you want is to get to court and have a judge basically approve a motion to dismiss and get it kicked out. So with all these allegations, they're throwing everything into their complaint in hopes that something sticks. Now, I am sure that some of these won't stick. I am sure that some of these defendants will be removed, and there might not even be a case once it gets sent back down to state court. However, this is important to understand the constitutional aspect of due process. Being able to have your day in court, being able to defend yourself, see the evidence against you, be able to hear the person that's accusing you of doing something. And when it comes to schools and their policy and their disciplinary proceedings, things can get a little muddied because it's not your traditional court setting. You're not facing, in most situations, criminal or civil liability. You're facing the disciplinary actions of what your future may hold, whether or not you're going to get kicked out of school, whether or not you're going to be suspended, whether or not you're going to have scholarship money removed. So there is that gray area. And overall, I want to ask you a question after I hear your input. What's disciplinary action like within med school? What does that look like, and how do students handle it?
Yeah, the disciplinary actions that occur or are offered is dependent on the offense. But there can be probation, there can be a leave of absence, there can be full on dismissal. But ultimately, putting myself into the student's shoes, thinking that this could potentially be career ending, not only would that hurt financially, he's taken out 2 years of medical student loans already, which is an immense amount. The reputation of himself, but also his family. They are immigrant family, so I don't know whether or not there are any other doctors in the family. Is he the first one to go? Like, that's a lot of pressure on a student. The next thing is just being able to think clearly in the moment, because sometimes when you are already spiraling out of control, you're thinking of the worst case scenarios, and then you get this letter that says that you could potentially be dismissed. When you get an email of any sort of potential disciplinary action in the middle of the night too, did he have the opportunity to reach out to administration for clarification? Was this a Friday right before a weekend? I can only imagine how much stress that is when you're already concerned about your career and your future, that now you get this email that you can't follow up with questions. A lot more evidence to come out to help the situation. We were hoping to just stay as neutral as possible and just analyze from our perspectives as a doctor and a lawyer. At no point are we passing any sort of judgment to the student or the patient or the administration of the school board.
And I think it leads to the bigger conversation of the mental state of one when they're going through their education, when they're going through medical school or law school. Of course, everybody is accountable to themselves. This student took his own life. There wasn't any gun to his head to take his own life. But for him, getting that email was cause enough to move forward in that direction. I'm curious whether or not he showed signs of any mental instability prior to that, or if this was just a one-off, a flood of pressure and a flood of stress that he just didn't know how to handle. Mental health awareness is extremely important in understanding the stress and pressure that a student faces. Because if this had been something that had maybe been building for the last 2 years, maybe it could have been prevented given the appropriate counseling or the appropriate outlets or the appropriate resources. I was a law student. I understand the pressures that come with it. There were some days that just seemed so daunting and so dark and so gray because of trying to achieve your goal. That resonates with me. But to the extent of taking your own life, that pushes past a certain barrier into a mental state that I have never really experienced before, and I can't really understand from that perspective.
Yeah, and in the US, we already have a shortage of physicians. This only shines light into the stress, difficulties, and pressures that medical students, resident physicians, and attending physicians have to deal with on a daily basis. We're constantly thinking about liability, getting sued by patients. Are we saying the right things? Are we looking at patients the right way? Anyone can always misinterpret our intentions, even though our intentions may be right. And so I hope that this case gives us some sort of conclusion, but I also hope it shines light and puts more onus on the medical professionals and the healthcare system itself to better support our students, to better support our medical personnel, even nurses and nurse practitioners and physician assistants. We all are under such stress that there needs to be better support. And to really bring up the support for mental health, support for work-life balance, there's just so much more that needs to be done so that we can continue to have physicians wanting to be physicians. At the rate we're going, maybe there's one day that no one wants to pursue this medical career anymore because of the high risk of loss of life, of suicide, of mental health, of physical health. When you're putting so much of yourself into studying, into learning as much as you can, into working as much as you can for your patient.
This is just overall a tragic event for all parties involved. Not only do you have parents losing a son, but you also have the patient, which is probably overlooked in the sense of her actions caused, in a sense, a suicide. Then you have the administration, you have the professors, and you have the peers, and you have the students that were working with this student. So overall, just a tragic event. We're not placing any blame on any particular individual or particular system. This just causes more awareness throughout. For those of you, medical students, law students, or anybody just overall struggling, please reach out for the appropriate resources. It may seem like a dark day. The stress may seem very, very daunting, but it's something that you can find a way through. You just have to be able to open yourself to getting the appropriate help.
I always appreciate your perspective and your legal input on these cases. This brings our episode to the end here. With Dr. Long and Lawyer Nick, we appreciate you guys joining us for another episode. Please make sure you follow us on social media and be on the lookout for our episodes that come out every Wednesday at 10 a.m. Central Time. See you next week.
Yes, we're doctors. Yes, we're lawyers. No, this podcast is not medical or legal advice. Do not take anything we say as a reason to perform your own heart surgery, represent yourself in court, or diagnose your neighbor's rash. This is for entertainment only. Think of it like hanging out with your smartest, wittiest friends, not a substitute for an actual appointment. If you act on anything we say without talking to your own professional, that's on you. Seriously, don't do that.